Hello and welcome to the debate. I'm your host Maqbool with you at PTV World. In today's show, we will be taking a look at two important stories. The first is in reference to what is going on in international politics, particularly the emerging US-India partnership and the much talked about meeting between the leaders of both India and the US in a recent meeting in Washington. And this was important not just in terms of the kind of red carpet welcome that was accorded to the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, but of course also in terms of a press conference, which is quite a rare sight, in which we saw the Indian Prime Minister also answering a couple of questions, one from the US-based journalist as well, in which he was asked about the issue regarding discrimination against minorities, especially Muslims, and what the government is doing in this regard, to which he has responded in saying that they value democracy and that they always have upheld that and there is no discrimination. Something, of course, that was then celebrated within India as a great response to the question. But in terms of the question marks that it has raised, not just, of course, in the way that the backlash then emerged against the journalist, but also in terms of the issues that were raised regarding Washington's response towards the government, towards putting on a blind eye and a deaf ear to what is going on within India. And then, of course, the subsequent questions also with regards to the way that this relationship is then going to emerge and what sort of a dynamic this partnership is going to see in terms of any sort of interest that the US might be looking into, while ignoring these hard realities of what is going on within India. What sort of course, engagement is expected, particularly in relation to its dynamics with China, and what sort of an ally and partner India is expected to be, and then of course what is India expecting the US to play its role within this emerging dynamic as well, because we of course know that both China and Russia are important countries for India, both in terms of the economic and trade relations, and then of course the way that the Indian Prime Minister and the government has moved forward with regards to the relationship with Russia, and of course being silent on the issue of Ukraine as well. We would also be taking a look at what this means in terms of the way that the international media of course has also responded, and how there are concerns regarding freedom of press with India also moving forward in terms of what is going on within the country, to something that is now being pressed in global indicators as well, with India being ranked as 161 out of 180 countries at the World Freedom Index. And especially when we speak about the dynamic with the US, which champions itself as somebody who safeguards democracy and who advocates for democracy around the world, it is a big question mark in terms of the way that India is unfortunately deteriorating in its democratic nature, and how then will this partnership be able to sustain itself. So we're going to be taking a look, of course, at all of this in our first segment of the show today. Our next one is going to be focusing on what the Chief of Army Staff in Pakistan has spoken about very recently after the attack that we have seen previously in Yob at the Quetta garrison, in which unfortunately at least 9 soldiers have appraised martyrdom. And this is just one of a series of attacks that Pakistan unfortunately has been witnessing on a regular basis for quite some time now. We also know that the Chief of Army Staff has spoken about the involvement that the Afghan Taliban regime has to play in this regard, and the way that they need to of course protect their territory being used against any other soil. And the army chief had also issued a stern warning, talking about how the presence of the banned Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan across the border is something that is being enabled by the kind of safeguards that are being provided to the TTP within Afghanistan, and that the Afghan nationals' involvement is also concerning, and so that the Afghan regime in the country needs to play a much stricter and important role in order to move ahead with this. And if not, then there will be an effective response that is going to be elicited from the Pakistan side. And so we're going to be taking a look at what this means in terms of the strategy that Pakistan will be employing in the absence of any sort of a convincing measure that is taken by the Afghan government and in the country moving forward, and then what sort of options exist in terms of making sure that the TTP are not given safe havens within the country. So we're going to be taking a look at all of this in our show today. For this and more, as always, in the studios, I've been joined by senior analyst Farrukh Pitafi. We've also been joined by Member Planning Commission of Pakistan, Dr. Ishtiaq Ahmad, in the studios with us. And for our first segment, we've also been joined online by Professor Scott Lucas, political analyst. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor Scott, and being a part of the discussion. And let me start with you, Professor Scott. We've spoken about, of course, how this very important meeting emerged, and how it was, of course, much talked about in terms of the kind of interaction there was going to be between the two leaders of India and the US, but more so, of course, than the debate that has then emerged since the meeting and the way that this partnership is now being viewed. In terms of just when we take a look at the kind of interactions that have taken place between both world leaders, do you think that there is anything that is fundamentally a step further in the way that the relationship has historically evolved, and that this particular interaction points towards a direction that may be different from that in the past?
Well, I think, if you don't mind, I think we even need to go even wider than the discussion, because it's not just a question of Prime Minister Modi's visit to the United States with that warm reception by President Biden and by Congress. It's what's happening right now, today, which is Modi's visit to France and his equally warm reception by President Macron, being the guest of honor on Bastille Day, this highest of French ceremonial days, and being given the Legion of Honor. Because it's not just India, US we're talking about here, it's India, US, and Europe in relation to a changing Asia. And by that I mean is that Modi is playing power politics, and he's played it very effectively in the last 18 months. If you had asked me this question just over a year ago, I would have pointed to real tensions between the US and India, not primarily over human rights within India, although that's the concern of some in the US, but the Indian refusal to criticize the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and indeed to profit from it by getting cheap oil from Russia and continuing to get military supplies from Russia. But what has happened in the past 18 months is a bargain. It's a live and let live. India is not expected to criticize the Russian invasion. It's allowed to get the cheap oil as long as it does not approve of the Russian invasion, as long as it does not support Vladimir Putin diplomatically and publicly, and it stays on the fence. In return for that, in return for India not staying in the middle, the US and France, and I suspect other countries, will woo India with defense deals. We're talking about jet fighters, fighter jets from France, the Rafale jet fighter jets. We're talking about French submarines, the Scorpion class subs. We're talking about US naval drones, and we're talking about engines from both countries for India's warplanes. Why are they doing that? Because last year, India took about 2/3 of its military supplies from Russia. And France and the US, and more broadly Europe, will woo India away from that relationship with Russia. And in addition to that, they are happy to bolster India against China, trying to make the idea that if there's going to be a confrontation with China, we want India on our side. So all of that is in the mix before you even talk about the personal relationship that Modi might have with Biden or with Macron.
Right, absolutely. And these are important dynamics that we'll explore further as well. And Dr. Ishtiaq, I want to understand also in terms of the big question mark as to why this is happening. And we keep on talking about previously, of course, how this is how international politics work. And there are, of course, other concerns that countries have and their interests, which are, of course, very important. Something which the former president of the United States have also hinted towards as to why this particular direction is being taken and how these are important concerns concerns in a country's relationship. But then I want to understand why, as Professor Scott was talking about, so many areas are being ignored or are being let go. Is there something more fundamentally valuable that is coming in from India, perhaps in terms of its dynamic with China, that is far more important than any of the other dynamics? And exactly what will that amount into in terms of in quantifiable terms, because I want to understand the kind of role that then India can play as an ally, especially with regards to China, if that seems to be the ulterior motive.
Well, you know, the first thing to understand is that if we go back, say, 30 years, when India started its, journey to capitalism, America was at its unilateral moment. Imagine, at that time what India is doing, seeking partnership with America, asserting itself, having a relationship with China. India would not have been able to do that. Over time, what we have seen is because of, economic growth and its increasing global presence, soft and hard, India has been able to, make its mark in Asia. Obviously, China is no comparison. China has established itself as a rising power, Asian power, and also asserting itself globally. But, India is a reality. In the meantime, what we have seen is that era of unilateralism by Americans is long over. I think the war on terror and the defeats in Iraq and Afghanistan, rendered a mortal blow to American supremacy, and therefore we find India, Russia, China, these are newer powers and newer blocks that are emerging. So there are certain things which are basically, if Arundhati Roy has a fascinating article in the New York Times, called The Illusion of India-US Partnership. And I will just mention 3 points which are extremely, significant. We should not be surprised about America, despite the fact that the Democrats are in power, saying nothing about the rise of Hindutva and the implications for Indian minorities, especially the Muslims, and particularly in Kashmir. Because America has throughout history cultivated ties with dictatorships. America is democratic inside and dictatorial outside, and that is a paradox that we have seen being expressed, globally and regionally many times. Second is, India's current reality actually is refuting its previous history and the creed on which it was created and it was propounded, the idea itself, which was a secular republic, a diverse country where minorities were supposed to have equal rights. What we have seen in the past, 2 tenures of Modi is the rise of Hindutva and the implications we have seen particularly for our Muslim brothers and sisters in India, and in Kashmir we have seen in the last 2+ years. Second reality is that India is no match to China, which is another element that she highlights. For instance, China is, has grabbed, territory in the Ladakh region for several years, and India has not been able to do anything, despite the fact that Americans are trying to use India as a counterpoise to China, in this zero-sum game analysis that we see. But despite that, India is far weaker, even technologically, economically, geopolitically. So India's internal reality, which refutes its history, its relative power vis-a-vis China, and America's, traditionally paradoxical conduct, domestically democrat and internationally dictatorial. These are 3 realities I think I also personally subscribe to, and I think they will determine how things happen in the future.
Right, but you mentioned this article, and I want to explore the title further as well. Do you think that the partnership is really an illusion? Are you agreeing with that?
Well, you see, the thing is that, the 2 countries, there is a great power, America. It has a proud history. I'm not negating that America throughout history has been an empire which, has not benefited the world. Actually, America is a world unto itself. It is based upon successive migrations of people from across the world. That is the only, area in the world where someone's dream, from 0 to ultimate, can reach.
Okay.
And people from Asia, Africa, and they continue to benefit from that. But the idea itself, clashes with the conduct more recently during the neocons, and especially when we see India, America, a leader which was not allowed visa to travel to America is being, charmed by the American leadership, and that also from the Democratic Party, which I fail to understand, frankly speaking.
All right, Farrukh, I want to understand with the way that different countries are interacting with India at the moment, I want to understand whether or not that means that the stance that whatever is happening within India and whatever sort of violations or discrimination exists against minorities, especially Muslims, is something that is can very easily be ignored, and that this sort of stance is being strengthened because of the emerging partnerships with the US or Europe, and that may not then just be restricted in terms of Prime Minister Narendra Modi or the BJP, that in fact can fundamentally become the direction that India as a state will then be taking?
Right, Sana, and thank you very much for the opportunity. Regarding this whole thing, while Professor was actually talking about this, Dr. Ishtiaq was talking about, this title of the article. You questioned him regarding illusion. My humble submission is that it is not illusion, but delusion, right?
Okay.
Because at this moment, let me be very honest regarding my own subject, and I hope I don't offend both the experts on the panel, but I think that I have constantly thought that IR, international relations, is a subject that can hardly be called a science, right? And why is it so? There is this problem of duplication. You cannot actually duplicate the results in a lab or somewhere. You have not been able to predict anything in this world, so far correctly. For example, the IR experts were not able to predict the collapse of Soviet Union. There was only one telegram, the long telegram, that actually predicted the start of Cold War. Nothing else of the sort, right? So at this moment, all our experts keep on trying to make sense of what is going on in the international order. And what exactly is the nature of international order, Saram? You have to remember, I don't know whether you watch wrestling matches at all or not, but there is a form of wrestling, it is called Royal Rumble, where everybody fights everybody simultaneously, right? At this moment, things are trying to find a structure. There is no structure so far. Who is going to fight with whom? We don't know right now. So what exactly is happening? Because a very boisterous, very aggressive government is in India, and then of course we have seen that the Western order has seen quite turbulence because of all that. Right now, India keeps on extracting benefits from all and sundry. But when you talk about India's role as a counterweight to China, whether India will want to do it is a big question, right? At this moment, it seems that India keeps on promising the sun and the moon to everybody. But that is not in reality true. For example, Ashley Tellis, who actually sort of played a very pivotal role when the US and India were coming close. At that time, he played a role. Now he repeatedly says that the US is wrong in expecting that India is going to play a military role against China at all. Why is it so? Because India has its own interest. Now, many things are going on inside India. You were talking about minorities and how they are being discriminated against, right? But there is another aspect that is quite interesting. I think that aspect regarding minorities is something that relates to changing DNA of India's national character. That is not going to reverse very quickly, no matter Congress comes, no matter whosoever comes, right? But at this moment, there is another thing that is happening, and that is projection of India's power, external power, at the cost of its internal economic stability. Because of that, because all those companies, I keep on giving example of Adani Group, because they kept on focusing more and more on speculating through their shares, and they kept on building their empire further and net worth also. They haven't been able to create jobs. So what happens? Anything of this sort augurs badly, and it actually promises that there is a bubble that is eventually going to burst. Whenever that does, India is going to face turbulence that we haven't even anticipated so far. So that being said, at this moment there's something else also going on. Right now, this is India's election year. Within 1 year, there's going to be an election in April or May. They will have their election. So Modi needs as many, foreign accolades as possible. And then in America also, there is an election that is anticipated that is going to take place by the end of the next year. And there too, Indian community plays a very big role, larger than life role. Because of that, they are going to woo India as well. And then comes France, that Professor Dr. Lucas was talking about. That is quite interesting also, because since AUKUS started, there is a competition between America and France also to quote India, because India has deep pockets, and both these countries keep on expecting that their military hardware will be purchased. France especially so, because it received a snub when AUKUS deal was signed. Before that, there was a deal between Australia and Australia and France to produce submarines that are propelled by diesel engines. That was actually gutted, and then they got a nuclear powered submarine deal, and hence AUKUS was born. Because of that, I think France will keep on doing whatever it can to win over India, because it is about monies. Whatever money comes to the country, that actually empowers that country to be more, or that ruler to be more popular among the electorate.
Right, absolutely. Dr. Scott Lucas, the situation when we take a look, especially in terms of the entire episode with the US-based journalist as well, and then, of course, what followed is important in terms of any sort of internal accountability that also exists within the public eye in the US. And I want to understand whether there's more and more of that, or any serious sort of consideration coming towards the Biden administration in terms of its relationship with countries or leaders such as Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Right, Professor Scott, can you hear me?
If you can speak slowly for me, we have a bit of a sound issue. Go ahead.
Sure, absolutely. Regarding the concern against, of course, what we saw, the backlash that came after the US-based journalist questioned the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. This is important in terms of understanding if there is any sort of concern or accountability emerging from within the United States, from within the public, that the Biden administration needs to be cognizant of in terms of its dealings or interactions with countries or leaders such as the Prime Minister of India. Do you think that there is any serious sort of pressure coming in from the public?
I hate to say this, but when it comes to power politics, and this isn't true just of the US, although we're focusing on that, but it's true of other countries. It's true of France this week. It is inconvenient for human rights to be raised. And I say that with regret, because we know that's very important. But if I could give you a parallel example, the rehabilitation of the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, by multiple countries, and I have to say even Pakistan, after the assassination of the writer Jamal Khashoggi in 2018, is another example that because of the importance of Saudi money and Saudi oil, and we can devote a program to that, Saudi human rights issues are pushed to the side. And indeed, it is true of other countries with whom the US, Europe, Asia countries, and Pakistan have dealt with. Again, on the specifics on India, there are people in the United States who are concerned about what is happening to minorities in India, not just the Muslim minority, the Sikh minority, There are people who are concerned about other issues of discrimination that have taken place. There are people who are concerned about the issue of Kashmir. But the reality is, as you've been discussing with the esteemed guest in the studio, is that India has leverage right now. India has leverage when it comes to its economic potential, which is much greater because of the size of the country than, say, Pakistan at the moment. India has leverage because of this position it has between the US and Russia, and between Europe and Russia, and it has leverage because of China being a concern for so many countries. And the other thing that I would add to that, and again, I'm sorry, but I've got to be honest with you, that in the eyes of the Americans right now, you look at someone like Modi, who has been in power now for a long time, I think probably closing in on a decade in India, that you look at that government, which quite firmly, sometimes with repression, stays in power, and you compare that with Pakistan, which has had a lot of instability in recent years, and you all know about that. Countries will go with India right now with the belief that the country which may not respect human rights, or the government that may not respect human rights, but the one that is going to be in power for some time and that can deliver on what the US or Europe or Asia wants, that's the one that they're going to cozy up to. And that's what we've seen both in the US and in France in the last 2 weeks.
Right. Dr. Ishtiaq, the situation in, of course, the way that Pakistan wants to make sure that this is a concern and that people around the world know what it is that we're talking about is also important, not just in terms of what is going on in illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir, but of course within India, then also sort of bring about the true picture of what the democratic stance that is being pushed forward from the Indian side is also laid bare. And I understand that despite that, of course, there will be other concerns that countries will have, and they will have their own interactions with India. But in terms of being able to make it at least difficult for countries to justify their interactions, or for them to be able to ignore certain specific episodes or actions, what sort of a way forward can there possibly be, and what sort of support can Pakistan then garner from beyond its own country, so that on platforms which are international, on occasions which are international, at least this voice is there and is the big elephant in the room, if nothing else?
Well, Sana, first of all, let me just make a point about a Middle Eastern issue that Dr. Lucas raised. Since I claim a bit of humble, expertise on this region, and I think, that issue basically was more of a political stuff, gimmickry on the part of Biden administration. Sometime, in Middle Eastern Gulf politics, the US internal, politics, between Republicans and Democrats comes up. Even the Turkish leadership played a lot of politics on that issue. We have to see what the great Saudi leadership has done inside Saudi Arabia in the past 6 or 7 years. It's a revolution in the making, and it is benefiting not only Saudi Arabia, entire Gulf, the Middle East, and even countries like Pakistan and perhaps the entire Muslim world, if we go by the depth of reforms which are taking place. As far as the situation in Kashmir and the peculiar context of India in the recent past is concerned, and I think Farrukh has already raised a point. I'm really alarmed by the fact that if we compare the trajectory of India and compare, for instance, with our own history since 1979, we can talk about the future if we have a comparable example in our own region, not in Europe or elsewhere. And I think we have learned our lesson with the rise of extremism and the deadly consequence of mixing religion with politics that we have experienced in the form of a terrorism that we have never, can imagine. India, unfortunately, is entering a phase which we have already experienced and learned our lesson. And we are really finding very difficult the first topic that you discussed here, the killing spree that continues Pakistan on the behest of, this TTP terrorism, having safe havens in Afghanistan, and our leadership, both military and civilian, continue to raise issues with Afghanistan on that count, and we still are worrying about it. My worry about India is that India has become wealthy enough, and this wealth is linked with Hindutva itself, not only inside India but outside India also, globally speaking. When religion mixes with politics and it also is complemented with the capital, then I think we can see far more deadlier consequences in next door India. The problem is that we should not be happy about it. An equal number of Muslims live in India. So is the case in Bangladesh. So if anything happens to the largest minority of India in the future, under BJP or maybe much worse form of dictatorship, we cannot stay silent. The whole region will suffer. We have had our share, but imagine the next 30, 40 years evolving in the direction which India has taken, away from secularism, away from rule of law, away from constitution, away from basic human rights. And that form is visible right now before our eyes in Indian held Kashmir, where a settler colonialism, since 2019 is going on with every passing day. The demographic reality, the ethnic reality, the Muslim reality is being reshaped, re-engineered right before our eyes. And I think that is a worrying aspect. As far as Pakistan is concerned, I think we should open our door of diplomacy, for peace, for reconciliation, for conflict resolution. We should not behave like India. We should not shut our doors to diplomacy, right, left, center, with Afghanistan, with India. We should try to be a part of a regional integration process, which is where prosperity lies. But if we behave internally as Modi government has done, and as RSS is backing it, they are starting their journey from where we did in 1979.
Right, and I want to explore two themes with regards to India further a bit. Farrukh, the first, when we talk about what Dr. Ishtiaq was also referring to in terms of how then there is, of course, consequence in the way that there is a disintegration, and something that perhaps was also pointed out by the former president of the US, speaking about countries in which minorities are not protected, they start pulling apart, and then whatever is going on within India will then eventually also lead to trouble within India. But shouldn't that also be a cause for alarm for other countries as well? Will that not also spill over to the region, or perhaps the interactions with other countries, and is also concerning and worrisome, and is not limited to the geographical boundaries of India, just that country? And secondly, when we talk about what earlier Professor Scott was referring to in terms of how unfortunately it becomes difficult to raise voice against human rights because of various concerns, and what states eventually shy away from doing so, but then that also means that individuals do also, and that they and in countries such as India, where there is deliberate attempt to silence any sort of dissenting voice, then how exactly will then any sort of violation be curbed, and eventual progress, or eventually a different direction is taken? How then is that going to happen?
Right, Sana, again, thank you very much for this question, because it gives me a lot of room to play. But since you actually brought up President Obama's quote, recent interview, let me say two things which might actually seem contradictory, but I am going to qualify that as well, how they are not. Barack Obama, former president of the US, actually recently said this, but and I'm a big fan of the man, right? I consider him one of the game changers who had great influence around the world, and he has been a voice of sanity. Unfortunately, most of these politicians remember these lofty ideals once they have actually lost power. They have stepped out of power, right? For example, who was the president who normalized Modi, first of all? If you remember, when Modi was not PM, he was about to become PM. At that time, there was a sanction on his entry into the US and Europe, right? And it was President Obama who actually lifted that ban and welcomed him with open arms. And you saw that Jadoo ki Japhi that Narendra Modi actually keeps on exchanging with others, right? Having said that, let me now also talk about, and I think that there is no contradiction there. Who says that great people cannot have their weak moments or their weaknesses? I think Obama is a voice for God, but sadly, he should have remembered these policies or these ideals when he was in power. Having said that, now let us move to what Dr. Ishtiaq was talking about. I'm really glad that he actually drew this parallel between India and what happened in Pakistan previously. And I see the point. I think that only fools refuse to learn from other people's mistakes. They have to make their own mistakes, and they keep on making mistakes, right? But my concern is that India and Pakistan are not the same country. Pakistan, whether you like it or not, is much smaller. India has more complications, and that actually makes it far more dangerous as a potential evil, force of evil. Why? Because you might not have seen all this appeasement that is going on has emboldened people to carry on doing exactly the kind of cruel acts that were against which actually India's constitution was written. For example, in Pakistan, no matter what, every religion has many interpretations, Islam also, and we saw radical extremists actually kept on using it for their nefarious purposes. But Abrahamic religions at least try to believe in equality, right? Egalitarianism. And with many interpretations of Hinduism, when you talk about the one that is favored by Hindutva, inequality is favored concept. What happens then? You have recently seen the episode of a poor low caste man actually sitting at a shop, and somebody from higher caste, from Narendra Modi's party, goes there and pees on him, urinates on him, right? With that kind of cruelty, I don't remember any similar episode taking place ever in Pakistan, right? And then people being murdered, killed also. India's, the most vulnerable might seem to be Muslims, but they are not. The actual most vulnerable community is the majority, and that is Dalits and the lower caste people, right? And India actually kept on seeking caste reports, that you should have some audit of what caste has what population. And because this elite capture of Brahmins and the upper caste Hindus actually is complete, they keep on using Muslim baiting and Christian baiting to consolidate Hindu vote. And that's how in the end the Dalits also end up voting for them despite being the biggest victim. And then let me remind you another thing. Whatever India was, India always had great institutions. Compared to us, their judiciary used to be talk of the town and great institution. Similarly, their constitution, similarly, their parliamentary democracy. And their media, by the way, also. What has happened? Remember Article 360, when was it scuttled? 2019. Indian Supreme Court has finally started hearing the case. 4 years later, Sana, 4 years later, about something about lives of millions of people. Similarly, other cases also, there are cases which haven't been heard even now. Similarly, media has been taken over by a few, business groups like Adani and Ambani's, which are friendly to Modi and come from actually Gujarat. And similarly, India's army also has been controlled so much that now their seniority principle that used to be there, that used to be a cherished principle, is gone. And we saw what happened to Bipin Rawat. Whatever you are trying to do, modernizing or dividing or redoing the theatres, it is incomplete work. So all this idea that India is an emerging military power is wrong, because India takes eons to mobilize its troops to bring it to borders. With that kind of a situation, Sana, Now, everyone is silent because Modi is there, their party is there, and out of fear, the opposition cannot actually really raise these issues. Once Modi is gone, you will see how much damage has been done to India.
Okay, Professor Scott, last question to you. When we talk about, of course, what we'd expect in terms of actions having consequences and how the world needs to move in a positive direction, does that mean that when we take a look at measures such as resolutions, such as international norms, laws, provisions such as putting sanctions, getting the world in order, do you think that none of these have any value, or do you think then their sort of usage or effectiveness only then depends again on the same principles that are there in terms of how countries interact with each other? I'll repeat, Professor Scott, for your sake. When we take a look at the situation in terms of talking about actions having consequences, then what about the measures such as having international resolutions, international norms and laws, about the possibility of the provision of sanctions or getting the world in order? Do you think that none of these then are effective measures and add no value to how the international community interacts? Or do you think that they're only useful and effective based on the same principles upon which these countries are interacting with each other, and so will only depend on that?
It's kind of really difficult to hear you. I apologize, but I think you're asking me about the international community and in terms of the consequences if we do not defend human rights, or what we can do to defend human rights. And so hopefully I've got the gist of it. What I would start with is this, that it is always the case in international politics, as long as I've lived, and I think for a long time before that, that a lot of it will turn on might makes right. And at the highest level of politics, if a country has economic strength, if it has military strength, or if politically it's in a position where it's felt like it's needed by others, then it can do what it wants to do domestically and it can get away with it. And again, we've cited the example of Saudi Arabia. We could talk about Turkey, where we've seen that in recent days as well. We can talk about times where Pakistan has been valuable to other countries, and so its domestic affairs, people said, we really don't care what's happening inside Pakistan. I'm going to make two broad points. The first is generally, and that is what is important to me as an analyst. Even though might makes right quite often, at the grassroots, it is important that you in the media, that analysts like your esteemed guest, like others, don't lose sight of the individual and of the need to protect the individual and of the need to raise these human rights issues. So even if Mr. Modi doesn't hear it this week from Joe Biden, that he will hear it, for example, with the resolution that was passed in the European Parliament just yesterday, which did criticize the right violation, for example, in Manipur province. The second point is that at the end of the day, and I'm going to speak to you in terms of Pakistan, to have influence, to raise these concerns, it is important for each country to get its house in order. And I do think that you have a challenging time in Pakistan right now regarding certain political and legal issues that you know about. And I think these are dealt with fairly.
Right, absolutely. Professor Scott, unfortunately, we've lost your voice, but thank you very much for joining us and being a part of the conversation. Very quickly, we'll take also a look at the situation with reference to the spike in terrorist activities within Pakistan. And Dr. Ishtiaq, we know that the Chief of Army Staff has spoken about and talked about in a very strict sense regarding the involvement of the Afghan Taliban regime and the role that they can play and that they should be playing in terms of protecting our territory and not allowing anybody, particularly the TTP, to use their soil against Pakistan and, of course, other territories as well. Do you think that a real expectation can possibly be there, given how historically we haven't really seen a sort of a response as we would have liked from the Afghan Taliban?
Well, Sana, you see, the reality is that what we see in the last, say, 2 years or so in Afghanistan, there is a different regime, but it is history is that there was a 20-year war. In this 20-year war, the Taliban from Pakistani side were, fighting alongside Afghan Taliban against NATO and American forces. Obviously, Pakistan came under tremendous pressure, but 2 decades is a very long time, and the involvement of so many countries, and there is a backlog we are seeing here. It's a very difficult relationship, but Pakistan, continues constructive engagement with Afghanistan, whether it was under the previous government or the Taliban regime, or even back in the 1990s. We have a multiple level relations, it's social, cultural, economic, trade, transit trade. So there at one level relationship remains normal. At the security level, there have been complications over the decades, not necessarily this year. So Pakistan has been insisting that these tens of thousands, perhaps dozens, we can say not 40,000 with the families, but there is a visible TTP presence in Afghanistan territory.
Okay.
Simple.
All
so
right.
What we are asking them to some kind of, they have to ensure that Afghan territory is not used against any neighboring country, including against Pakistan.
All right.
A couple of steps the Taliban regime has taken, but they are not enough so far.
All right. Farrukh, anything you'd like to add?
Right. Given that the time that remains, all I can do is condemn this heinous crime at Job. And not only that, I spent 15 days thanks to the hospitality of 12th Corps, Balochistan Corps and Balochistan government in Quetta and Balochistan. I've met many soldiers there, and one thing is for sure, this is not acceptable. Whosoever is behind it will be taught a lesson, and that is not all. There, any country that has been supporting them and has been providing them all these, hiding places will also have to be taught a lesson. That said, we have to look inwards as well and start acting against those people who might be supporting such elements. And there are elements who might be supporting them. So we have to fight them as well.
Right. Thank you, Farrukh. Thank you very much, Dr. Ishtiaq, for joining us and being a part of the discussion. That's all we have from the debate. See you tomorrow.